Thank you for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam. Tonight's part 4 of the John McCain story. We are deeply sorry that our last show was inadvertently canceled. It was a technical situation, but you can depend, if at all possible, we're going to be on the air with the show. This is the final segment of the John McCain story. Whether he was a hero or Manchurian candidate, as the host of Lessons of Vietnam will not give you a yes or no answer. We have looked at the supporters of John McCain. We've looked at what John McCain had to say himself, and now this segment is going to talk a little bit about those who kind of detractors of John McCain. So after all that's put together, you decide what you want to do as far as make up your own decision. Getting into the base of the matter, we're Lessons of Vietnam show where we're telling the story of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served, and we're trying to get rid of the myths and half-truths and so forth. I am your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 67-68. We're broadcast courtesy of Nissan Communications World Headquarters in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you have a comment or a suggestion or to be a guest, contact me, Bill Dixon, at dixonbill80@yahoo.com. So just drop me a line and say you'd like to be a guest or whatever. If you see anything on the show that you don't think is what it's supposed to be, send me a note and let's talk about it. And let me see if I can get it straight. To participate tonight in the show or any other time, you can dial 919-518-9773, or even better, as we go on Skype, Computers 2K Voice. We're on Skype now. I'm at home in North Raleigh, and I am not in the studio. It's in East Raleigh. So we're doing it from Skype, but you come on and do Skype. Veterans Crisis Line. I stand from time to time with the Patriot Guard Riders, and there's just too many times that we're standing for young veterans out there. If you are a veteran, you are a friend of a veteran or a family member of a veteran, and you're struggling or they're struggling, please call the Veterans Crisis Line. There's people there, good people who are willing to and want to talk to you and help you. Quite often, if you just got somebody to talk to and get you down and so forth, so call that number and let's keep things going. Okay, as we're getting into John McCain now, we're starting here at the bottom right-hand corner. It's kind of hard, but that's a sketch by Mike McGrath, who was one of the POWs, and he did a book illustrating some of the torture that the Vietnam veterans went through as POWs. We'll get right into it. There is no question that McCain was beaten and tortured and underwent brutal experiences. He put it this way in his book, Faith of My Fathers. I also suspect my treatment was less harsh than might be accorded other prisoners. This I attribute to my father's position and the propaganda value the North Vietnamese placed on possessing me. Injured but alive. Later, my suspicion was confirmed when I heard accounts of other POWs' experiences during their first interrogations. They had endured far worse than I had endured the cruelest torture imaginable. Ironically, McCain became the beneficiary of his mistakes as a pilot when his political career took off. Even though the official record stated he was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, he always claimed he was shot down by a SAM missile. The American voters knew about the terrifying SAMs, but not about the proven tactics to evade them. They had developed some pretty good tactics to evade the SAM missiles whenever possible. A pilot who served with McCain was quoted to say, "I guess the SAM sounds better, but I think it's a moot point. You're shot down, you're shot down." There was another misperception by the American public about McCain's refusal of early release offered him by the North Vietnamese. Even though Time magazine wrote that McCain was the only POW to have languished in the North Vietnamese prison in Hanoi for years rather than accept an early release because he felt it was dishonorable, he was not. The fact was that John McCain was a part of a self-functioning U.S. military chain of command and had three choices. One, he could ask his American senior ranking officer for his permission to accept an early release and go by the yes or no decision. So, two, he could decide on his own to violate regulations against accepting an early release and possibly face censure when all POWs were freed. Three, he could have quickly said no to the offer. This was not about John McCain's honor as had been made to appear, nor was it about his personal as to whether to accept an early release. As a propaganda ploy, the North Vietnamese also offered an early release to other POWs. It was about his own sworn duty as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, just like the 590 other American POWs being held. The POWs had set up a military organization in the prison. Communications was by the TAP code. Leadership was set up just as all U.S. military is set up, by rank and date of rank. McCain knew that Air Force Colonel Ted Guy was his senior ranking officer during their time at the Plantation prison camp. Colonel Guy was a stickler for the rules and discipline. After release, he brought charges against several POWs for collaborating with the enemy. Charges were later dropped. Guy felt no one should get an early release unless they were very sick or wounded, and felt but never said John McCain, who was badly wounded, might be an exception. But McCain did not ask Colonel Guy for permission. And as under the established military system, Colonel Guy had the authority to decide whether John McCain or anyone else accepted an early release, not John McCain. McCain's personal struggle with the decision with so much detail he talks about it in his book, Faith About Follows, was irrelevant to the actual situation. If he had agreed to leave early, he would have been violating standard regulations and be subject to future discipline action. Was not as kind of cut and dried as everybody thinks about. A year or so after being released, Commander John McCain addressed one of the most annoying questions of his fellow prisoners. And it says there of his, but it was about his fellow prisoners. Why did some prisoners choose to collaborate with the North Vietnamese communists? McCain blamed American politics. A 1974 essay for National War College, McCain stated, "The biggest factor in a man's ability to perform credibly as a prisoner of war is a strong belief in the correctness of his nation's foreign policy. Prisoners who questioned the legality of the war were extremely easy marks for the communist propaganda. Americans who captured after 1968 had proven to be more successful to the North Vietnamese pressure because they had been exposed to the divisive forces which had come into focus as a result of the anti-war movement in the United States." McCain recommended that the military teach its recruits not only how to fight, but also the reason for American foreign policy, like the containment of Southeast Asia communism. He also acknowledged that such a program of this nature could be constructed or construed as brainwashing or thought control, and came in for a lot of criticism. While running as a presidential candidate, McCain was also asked if he still had those views. His response was that he still believed the anti-war movement had hurt the morale of some prisoners, although he added the vast majority performed their duty with courage and resolve regardless of how controversy about the war influenced their view of it. This is from an article by Tim Calum at Salem News. McCain's attack on the last Vietnam POW underscores a history of poor discretion. Senator John McCain warmly greets Vietnamese Prime Minister Vo Van Kiet during a 1992 meeting in Hanoi. In 1965, Kiet ordered the execution of at least 3 American prisoners of war. McCain called Marine Robert Garwood, the last POW to emerge from Vietnam, a traitor. 2 of John McCain's former campaign aides have been exposed for having ties to the oppressive military junta in Myanmar. That revelation joined several other problems within the McCain camp, making news in recent months, and the repeated departures of his staff, leaving many questions about the senator's ability to know good from bad when selecting his friends and sources. In 1979, when the last POW unexpectedly returned from Vietnam with stories about other American POWs still alive, McCain went slightly ballistic and did everything he could to discredit a man who had been taken captive and held for an incredibly long 14 years. The story of Marine PFC Robert Garwood, the last POW to leave Vietnam, is a sad and twisted tale that most of us will never know the truth about. There's been a question, and I've done a show, go back and look at one of the previous shows about Garwood. The man was short. He had less than 30 days left in country before he came back, and it's hard to believe he went over to the other side with 30 days left. Anyway, no bond existed between this Marine and McCain as fellow former POWs, and Senator John McCain, who spent years as a prisoner of the Vietnamese during the war, turned on Garwood with a vengeance. The Marine may have deserved McCain's wrath, but many people say that the treatment from Arizona senator was way out of line. One problem that stands out like a sore thumb is the CIA's exposure of one of McCain's witnesses against Garwood as a person who actually did work within the Viet Cong. McCain was critical of Marine POW sightings. Garwood came back and said he had seen American POWs still alive over there. When it came to his claim of seeing other American POWs in the late 1970s, some elected officials backed Garwood and others went for his throat. The leader of the pack with the loudest and most critical voice was Senator John McCain. He was especially bothered by the Garwood made-for-television movie called The Last POW, the Bobby Garwood story, which debuted on TV in 1992. McCain didn't pull his punches. According to the website for the 3rd Marines, he accused PFC Garwood of being a traitor, a liar, and continued the anguish of the POW MIA families by lying about having seen live Americans. Of course, one senator's description of anguish is another person's or family's reason for hope. If there's any truth to his alleged sightings of post-war POWs, then it was hardly a disservice to the families of those men. McCain said, "These efforts and others constitute an enduring betrayal of his country, and anyone who may be manipulating Garwood for their own ends is a co-conspirator in this betrayal." McCain maintained that Garwood took up arms against American forces, guarded other American prisoners with rifles, and used a bullhorn to encourage American soldiers to surrender and make propaganda brass for the Vietnamese. Garwood was also accused of leaving propaganda notes at the gates of American bases, but later, upon closer examination, they did not appear to have been written by a person with English as a first language, and it is also reported that Garwood's signature originated from a rubber stamp. McCain used testimony of Garwood's fellow prisoners to take the Marines to task, and one person McCain used was Gustav Mayer, a former POW who accused Garwood of trying to recruit him into the North Vietnamese army. But that story fell apart when declassified CIA documents clearly showed Mayer who was believed to be the same suspect for Gustav Mayer, also known as Gus Maddox, who was an American prisoner of war working for the Viet Cong near Quang Nam Province. It isn't the entire picture, but certain parts of the testimony that John McCain used to harm the legacy and image of the last POW of Vietnam to emerge alive, Bobby Garwood, are truly without credibility. That is a sad thing if this Marine is not guilty as charged. It's a fascinating story that some will see as a more evidence of McCain's inability to execute good decisions in selecting the people he works with. Others in reviewing the information might see that Senator as a patriot who was determined to silence claims from a man who, at least to some degree, had a questionable relationship with the communist government of Vietnam. This is from an article by Sidney Schomburg. If you remember him, if you read the Killing Fields about Cambodia, this is the man who wrote that. With John McCain, there was one subject that was off limits, a subject Arizona Senator almost never brought up and has never been open about. His longtime opposition to releasing documents and information about American prisoners of war in Vietnam and the missing in action who are still not accounted for. Since McCain himself, a downed Navy pilot, was a prisoner in Hanoi for 5.5 years, his staunch resistance to laying open the POW MIA records has baffled colleagues and others who have followed his career. Critics say his anti-disclosure campaign, in close cooperation with the Pentagon and the intelligence community, has been successful. Literally, thousands of documents that would otherwise have been declassified long ago have been legislated into secrecy. For example, all the Pentagon debriefings of the prisoners who returned from Vietnam are now classified and closed to the public under a statute enacted in 1990 with McCain's backing. He says this is to protect the privacy of former POWs and gives it as his reason for not making public his own debriefing. But the law allows a returned prisoner to view his own file or to designate another person to view it. APBnews.com had repeatedly asked the senator for an interview for this article and for permission to view his debriefing documents. He did not respond. His office did send APBnews.com an email referring to a favorable article about the senator in a January 1st issue of Newsweek. In the article, the reporter Michael Isikoff said that he was allowed to review McCain's debriefing report and that it contained nothing incriminating. Although in a phone interview, Isikoff acknowledged that there were redactions. In the document, Isikoff declined to say who showed him the document, but APBnews.com has learned it was McCain. And you can see a document down there that has been redacted. It's hard to read because all the stuff has been marked out. That's what he was talking about. Many Vietnam veterans and former POWs have fumed at McCain for keeping those and other wartime files sealed up. His explanation offered freely in Senate hearings and floor speeches that no one has been proven still alive and that releasing the files would revive painful memories and cause needless emotional stress to former prisoners, their families, and the families of MIA still unaccounted for. A small number of former POWs, MIA families, and veterans have suggested there's something especially damning about McCain that the senator wants to keep hidden. Without release of the files, such accusations must be viewed as unsubstantiated speculation. The main reason, however, for seeking these files is to find out if there is any information in the debriefing or any other MI documents that McCain and the Pentagon have kept sealed about how many prisoners were held back by North Vietnam after the Paris Peace Treaty was signed in January of 1973. Defense and intelligence establishments have long resisted the declassification of critical records on this subject. McCain has been the main congressional force behind this effort. The prisoners returned in 1973. They saw 591 Americans repatriated by North Vietnam. The problem was that the U.S. intelligence list of men believed to be alive at that time in captivity in Vietnam, Laos, and possibly across the border in southern China and the Soviet Union was much larger. Possibly hundreds of men larger. The State Department stated publicly in 1973 that intelligence data showed the prisoner list to be starkly incomplete. For example, only 9 of the 591 returnees came out of Laos. Though experts in U.S. military intelligence listed 311 men as missing in the Hanoi-run country alone, and their field reports indicated that many of these men were probably still alive. And now we're talking about Laos. Hanoi said it was returning all the prisoners it had. President Nixon on March 29, 1973, seconded that claim, telling the nation on television, all of our American POWs are on their way home. Now, I know for a fact that those 9 men were from Laos were getting ready to be sent back to Laos when they were released. But Norman Gaddis, Brigadier General, who's been on the show several times, was the ranking officer still there at the time. And he told a North Vietnamese colonist he was not leaving unless they left with him on the plane. And those 9 were allowed to leave with the rest of them. So when Vietnam says they're all American prisoners, they were released. They may have been telling the truth, but they're easy to move them over into Laos and Cambodia and into China and to the Soviet Union. So now let's keep that on going. This discrepancy has never been acknowledged or explained by officials in Washington. Over the years in Washington, McCain, at the time almost single-handedly, has pushed through Pentagon-desired legislation to make it impossible or much harder for the public to acquire POW MIA information and much easier for the defense bureaucracy to keep it hidden. In 1989, 11 members of the House of Representatives introduced a measure they call the Truth Bill. A brief and simple document, it said they, or the head of each department or agency which holds or receives any records and information, including live sighting reports, which have been correlated or possibly correlated to United States personnel listed as prisoner of war or missing in action from World War II. The Korean conflict and the Vietnam conflict shall make available to the public all such records and information held or received by that department or agency. In addition, the Department of Defense shall make available to the public with its records and information a complete listing of United States personnel classified as prisoners of war, missing in action, or killed in action, body not returned from World War II, the Korean conflict, and the Vietnam conflict. Bitterly opposed by the Pentagon, the Truth Bill got nowhere. It was reintroduced in Congress of 1991 and again disappeared. Then suddenly out of the Senate birthed by the Arizona senator, a new piece of legislation emerged. It was called the McCain Bill. This measure turned the Truth Bill on its head. It created a bureaucratic maze from which only a fraction of the available documents could emerge, and it became law. So restrictive were its provisions that one clause actually said that the Pentagon didn't even have to inform the public when it received intelligence that America was still alive in captivity. The McCain Act does not specifically order the classification of the information. Further, it provides the Defense Department with other justifications for withholding documents. One such clause says that if the information may compromise the safety of any United States personnel who remain not accounted for, but who may still be alive in captivity, then the Secretary of Defense may withhold that record or any other information from the disclosure otherwise required by this section. This means that the Defense Department is not obligated to tell the public about prisoners believed alive in captivity and what efforts are being made to rescue them. It only has to notify the White House and the intelligence committees in the Senate and House. The committees are forbidden under laws from releasing such information. The McCain Act is now being used to deny access to other sorts of records. For instance, a part of the APBnews.com Freedom of Information Act request for the records of a mutiny on a merchant marine vessel in the 1970s was rejected by a Defense Department official who cited the McCain Act. Similar requests for information about Americans missing in the Korean War and declared dead for the last 45 years have been denied by officials who reference the McCain Act. And then there is the Missing Service Personnel Act, which McCain succeeded in gutting in 1996. A year before the act had been strengthened with bipartisan support to compel the Pentagon deploy more resources with greater speed to locate and rescue missing men. The measure imposed strict reporting requirements. McCain amended the heart out of the statute. For example, the 1995 version required a unit commander to report to his theater commander within 2 days that a person was missing and describe what rescue and recovery efforts were underway. The McCain Amendment allowed 10 days to pass before a report had to be made. One final takeaway, a compromise that completely destroyed the proposed bill in the law was McCain's removal of all enforcement teeth. The original act provided for criminal penalties for anyone such as military bureaucrats in Washington who destroyed or covered up or withheld from families any information about a missing man. McCain erased this part of the law. He said the penalties would have a chilling effect on the Pentagon's ability to recruit personnel for its POW/MIA office. McCain does not deal light with those who disagree with him on any of these issues or who suggest that the evidence indeed shows that a significant number of prisoners were alive and hidden away as future bargaining chips when he came home in a group of 591 released in 1972. Over the years, he has regularly vilified any group or persons who keeps trying to pry out more evidence about MIAs. He calls them hoaxers, charlatans, and conspiracy theorists. He decries the bizarre rantings of the MIA hobbyists and described them as individuals primarily who make their effort living off or keeping the issue alive. And I'm certain there are people out there who are doing that, but there's also some good people out there. McCain has said again and again that he has seen no credible evidence that more than a tiny handful of men might have been alive in captivity after the official prison return in 1973. And my question is, John, what about those? Now, there is a sighting that was done some years after all the prisoners were supposed to come home. There was the USA and a call sign was written in the sand with rocks. McCain dismissing all of the subsequent radio intercepts, live sightings, satellite photos, CIA reports, defector information, recovered enemy documents and reports of ransom demands. Thousands of pieces of information indicated live captives as meaningless. He has even described these intelligence reports as the rough equivalent of a UFO sighting and alien sightings. A question that defies easy explanation is why there has never been any significant public outcry over the POWs who didn't come home, or about the machinations of public officials like McCain who carefully wove a blanket of secrecy about the issue. It can only be understood in the context of what the Vietnam War did to the American mind. In other words, when it was over and people come home, the American public wanted to forget it and go on with their life, and as they did in World War II in Korea. The Washington Press Corps openly soft once before on the prisoner issue, again benefiting McCain. That was in 1991-93 during the proceedings of the Senate Select Committee on POW/MIA Affairs. McCain starred on that committee, working hand in hand with his new ally, Senator John Kerry, the panel's co-chairman, to play down voluminous evidence that sizable number of men were still held alive after the prisoners returned in 1973. One example, at the time of the committee's hearings, the Pentagon had received more than 1,600 first-hand sightings of live American prisoners and nearly 14,000 second-hand reports. The intelligence officers who gathered these reports from refugees and other informants in the field described a large number of them as credible and so marked their reports. Some of the informants had been given lie detector tests and passed. McCain and Kerry endorsed the Pentagon's findings. They also treated both the Pentagon and the CIA more as the committee's partners than as objects of its inquiry. McCain stood out because he always showed up for the committee hearings where witnesses were going to talk about specific pieces of evidence. He would belittle and berate these witnesses, question their patriotism and their otherwise scoffing at their credibility. All this is on record in the National Archives. It became clear over the months of hearings and sparrings that the primary goal of Kerry-McCain alliance was to clear the way for normalization of relations with Vietnam. They did it in two ways. First, by regularly praising Hanoi for its cooperation in the search of information about the unaccounted for prisoners, and then by minimizing and suppressing the volume of evidence to the contrary that had been unearthed by the committee's staff investigators. June 27, 2007, interview between retired Army Colonel Earl Hopper and the interviewer Jerry Kiley of Veterans Against John McCain. As an example, and I quote this because it can be checked out, McCain personally wrote an article in the magazine U.S. News and World Report where he stated that during the time he was a prisoner, in fact, I think it was 5 to 7 days after he was captured, he asked North Vietnamese to take him to the hospital, the Vietnamese hospital. Earl Hopper, this is his comments. You see his picture there with a hat on. I'm a U.S. Army retired colonel. I spent 30 years in the Army, was Airborne Special Forces. I fought in Europe, Korea, and Vietnam. My oldest son was also on active duty. He was in the Air Force and shot down over North Vietnam. He remains missing in action. Although the government has declared him dead, we have no evidence of his death. From the very beginning, in talking to the returned POWs, in the very beginning, we began to hear some very bad things about John McCain and his activities while he was in the POW camp. And that picture, the black and white pictures of it, that of his son who's still missing. And in so doing, he promised them that he would give them classified military information. They took him to the hospital, questioned him. This is back to the communists with John McCain. And in doing so, John McCain promised them he would give them classified information. They took him to the hospital, questioned him, and he gave them highly classified information. The most important of which was he gave their package route, which was a route to bomb North Vietnam. He told in detail the altitude they were flying, the direction, and if they made a turn, and how to get into North Vietnam. In other words, what this is saying, that the planes flew basically the same time, the same way every day, and he told them what those were. He also gave them where the targets were, the primary entry, whether it was a railroad, whether it was a bridge, whether it was an ammunition or fuel dump, or whatever it was. He gave them the primary targets the United States was interested in. And he gave them that information. After he gave them that information, the Vietnamese naturally moved their anti-aircraft defenses to those areas and built them up and strengthened them. They also moved the rockets, aircraft weapons into the package route of where the airplanes were flying in or aggressing. Results of this, according to information that came out later on in intelligence, was that the Vietnamese started knocking down our aircraft in greater amounts than they had before. In fact, there was an estimate that we started losing 60% more aircraft and more men than we had previously. This went on for about a month, and it got so bad that they finally called off the bombing of North Vietnam because of information that McCain had given them. When he returned, there were several American prisoners to include 5 colonels. Colonel Ted Guy was the one that wanted to prefer charges against McCain and 2 or 3 other returned POWs, because during the time they were in prison, they were not acting in accordance with the military code. As a result of these other colonels wanting to prefer charges against them, the secretaries of the services got together and they decided that no, they did not want these renegade, my words, renegade, prisoners of war coming home to be charged and court-martialed. So the secretaries of the armed services decided and told the other POWs they would not allow these particular POWs to be charged and be court-martialed over their activities while in the POW camps. Consequently, none of the POWs ever went into the court, and never any legal action taken against them for being traitors while they were in captivity. Now, this is all being said by the gentleman I introduced you to. Interviewer, Earl, is it true that I heard mentioned before that McCain did not receive any increase in his military rank, which was common? Could you talk about that for a second? That's true, Earl says. A man, if he's in captivity and either a prisoner of war or missing in action, is on active duty. The very same as if he was stationed right here in the United States. He gets promotions along with his peers. He gets his increase in pay. His wife still gets the allowance that he sent to her and so forth. And he is promoted along with his peers here in the States. Both in the same year group as prisoner of war, missing in action gets promoted along with the active duty people. McCain did not do it. He did not get promoted even when he returned. Now, the Navy knew of his activities while he was in the POW camp because the enemy North Vietnamese widely broadcast over their radio what McCain was doing, and in fact praised McCain for doing it. So he got no promotion at all while he was in captivity. Other POWs that were in captivity at the same time, they got their promotions at the time they were supposed to. Interviewer, and Earl, some people say that what McCain did was at the very least collaborations and worse treasonous. Would you say that you agree with that? No, I agree with only part of it. He was treasonous. McCain, for what he did while he was in captivity, was a traitor because he gave information to enemy, classified military information to the enemy, which caused the deaths of many of his fellow aviators that came in behind him. Interviewer, do you feel betrayed by McCain? Earl says, absolutely. Every American should feel betrayed by McCain, and especially every military man, and especially the pilots that flew in Vietnam after McCain was captured. I've been in Hanoi. I've seen that sign they put up for him when he was captured there by the lake. The sign even made a mistake on it. They said that he was from the U.S. Air Force. They also called him McCain and not McCain. But the sign is there. I've seen it myself. So, okay. Orson Swindle, or Swindell, I'm going to call him Swindle, who slept next to John McCain for more than a year in the Hanoi Hilton, happened upon Craig Wilbank's handiwork on the web recently. He was horrified. He disagrees with just about everything that comes out of Harper's mouth. As to the suggestion that McCain was responsible for his own broken bones, Swindle says, the man's airplane was turning ass over a tea kettle. Getting in the right position is sometimes damn difficult in this case. He was missing the wing of an airplane and the airplane was tumbling. For anybody to make a statement, they display their ignorance, and I don't care who they are. That was the man who was in prison with him, McCain. This is an article by Jenny Vaughn from Hanoi, and in the Hanoi Trans Minh Ha Agency of Free Press. I first met John McCain in 1967, says Tran Trong Nguyen. He was a tough and strong man. He was loyal to his ideology. From 1968 to 1973, Duet was the warden of Hanoi Hilton, the Wallow prison. Today, the prison museum displays black and white photos of Duet addressing rows of American inmates shortly before their release in the winter of 1973. As part of the peace accords, McCain was among those prisoners sent home. Now, long since retired, Dewitt mourns the death of his former prisoner, a lawmaker whom he credits with helping reestablish diplomatic relations between the United States and Vietnam. If I met him now, I would wish him good health, as a good friend always does, he says. But that is the former warden of the prison. But Dewitt denies that McCain and other POWs were mistreated during captivity. I think McCain told a lie in his book, he tells me. If we had tortured him, that would not have been the image of McCain coming back to Vietnam so many times and stimulating the Vietnamese-U.S. relationship. Daniel Quiddenbrick, U.S. ambassador to Hanoi says there is no doubt that U.S. prisoners were tortured. It's absolutely clear and indisputable that torture that many of the veterans suffered, the ambassador says, speaking to CNN on behalf of the U.S. embassies, which had been decorated with an American flag and bouquets of flowers and a portrait of McCain for his funeral. But the North Vietnamese still claim there was nobody tortured. After McCain's death, for 3 days, the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam opened its doors to the public, allowing well-wishers to sign a book of condolences. Among the Vietnamese visitors was a 35-year-old accountant named Boo Ngoc Son, who crosses himself and bows before McCain's portrait. Thank you very much, Senator John McCain, Son writes in the condolence book. Please help him continue supporting U.S. and Vietnam stronger and happier. That message was echoed by Pham Quang Vinh, Vietnam's deputy foreign minister and former ambassador to Washington. I came to show the deepest respect for John McCain, a great man, a great statesman, and a great friend of Vietnam, Vinh told CNN. Crittenbach argues that as a soldier and then as a peacemaker, McCain played a central role in developing the extraordinary close ties now enjoyed by the two former enemy states. It's close to miraculous to see how far we've come over the last few decades, the ambassador says. To go from the experience of the war and the experiences of Senator McCain and what we had initially to do to now, but here today we're talking about a partnership and a friendship. McCain's indelible mark on Vietnam can be seen on the walls of the prison where he was once languished. Not far from pictures of him as a wounded POW, there's a photo of a smiling McCain on tour of the museum in 2000. The senator often stopped into the Hanoi Hilton during more than 20 trips to Vietnam. Dewitt denies denies McCain or others were mistreated and says he punished any fellow guards who stepped out of line. There was no torture. Vietnamese people saved him, Dewitt says in an interview earlier this year at his home in the port city of Haiphong, where he displays both photos of American POWs and the more recent images of himself in military uniform posing with U.S. officials. By the end of his long years in prison, Dewitt said his relationship with McCain started to warm. Out of working hours, we considered each other friends, he said. He taught me English. He had good teaching skills. In his post-prison writing, McCain said that things got easier for him in the early 1970s, which he called his the coasting period. McCain read propaganda text about Vietnam Communist Revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh and was allowed to roam the prison yard with fellow Americans who named different sections of the compound after Vegas hotels. His former jailer preferred to focus on their rosier memories, recalling how they joked, shared stories about family and travel, and even dished about women. We laughed together and agreed that women are the same everywhere. They like flattery. They like to sulk, and they're jealous, he told Armed Forces AFP, while smiling. That is Dewitt, the prison warden. This is excerpts from Hero, John McCain as a phony and collaborator, what really happened in Counterpunch magazine. Excerpts on March 25th, 1999, two of his fellow POWs, Ted Guy and Gordon Sweet Larson, told the Phoenix New Times that while they could not guarantee that McCain was not physically harmed, and they doubted it, as Larson said, my only contention with the McCain deal is that while he was at the plantation, to the best of my knowledge and Ted's knowledge, he was not physically abused in any way. No one was at the camp. It was the camp that people were released from. Guy and Larson's claim are given credits by McCain's vehement opposition to releasing the government's debriefing of Vietnam War POWs. McCain gave Michael Isikoff a peek at his debriefing, and Isikoff declared there was nothing incriminating in them apart from the redactions. McCain had a unique POW experience. Initially, he was taken to the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison camp where he was interrogated by McCain's own account about 3 or 4 days. He cracked. He promised his Vietnamese captors, "I'll give you military information if you will take me to the hospital." His Vietnamese captors soon realized that their POW, John Sidney McCain III, came from a well-bred line of American military elites. McCain's father, John Jr., and grandfather, John Sr., were both full admirals. A destroyer of the U.S., John S. McCain, is named after both of them. While his son was held captive in Hanoi, John McCain Jr. from 1968 to 1972 was the commander-in-chief of U.S. Pacific Command. Admiral Kane was in charge of all U.S. forces in the Pacific, including those fighting in Vietnam. Admiral's bad boy was used to special treatment, and his captors knew that. They were working him. For his part, McCain acknowledged that the Vietnamese rushed him to the hospital, but denies he was giving any special medical treatment. However, 2 weeks into his stay at the Vietnamese hospital, the Hanoi press began quoting him. "It was not name, rank, and serial number or kill me as specified by the military code of conduct." McCain divulged specific military information. He gave the name of the aircraft carrier on which he was based, the number of U.S. pilots that had been lost, number of aircraft in his flight information, as well as information about the location of rescue ships. On the other hand, according to one source, McCain's collaboration had very real consequences. Retired Colonel Earl Hopper, who we just met, a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, contends that the information that McCain divulged, classified information to North Vietnam, used to hone their air defense systems. McCain told his North Vietnamese captors highly classified information, and most important of which was the package routes, which were routes used to bomb North Vietnam. He gave in details the attitude they were flying in the direction they made a turn. He gave them what primary targets the United States was interested in. Hopper contends that the information McCain provided allowed the North Vietnamese to adjust their air defense. As a result, Hopper claims the U.S. lost 60% more aircraft in 1968, calling off the bombing of North Vietnam because of the information McCain had given to them. Excerpt from 1992 Senate Select Committee on POWs. When 2 U.S. Army enlisted men were captured by the Viet Cong in 1963, they were plunged in an ordeal that would provide to be a relentless trial of body and spirit by torture. Once they were finally freed, however, their trials began all over again. When their statements critical of the U.S. Vietnam policy landed them in a military court facing a capital offense for violating the military code of conduct by aiding the enemy. But if your name is John McCain and your father and your grandfather were famous admirals violating the code of conduct by aiding the enemy, translates into fodder for a political career, book deals, and adulation bordering on sainthood. Even though news reports of McCain collaborating with the enemy continued from the time he was captured in 1967 through 1970, the Navy never considered prosecution as an option. Instead, Pentagon pencil pushers chose a political spin that lifted McCain, the former POW turned United States Senator, up to a glorified pedestal where he sprouted a halo and wings and became America's POW hero and a presidential candidate. No such luck for the 2 lonely grunts. Santoli was interviewed here. But on the Senate side, we have one person standing in the way of getting in a position that would have been very tough on government, bureaucrats who didn't tell the truth. And that one person was Senator John McCain. Corporal Bob Dumas, United States Army retired. He didn't want nobody to check his background because a lot of the POWs that was in the camps said he was a collaborator of the enemy. He gave the enemy the information they wanted. Dr. James Lucifer, former U.S. Senate Chief of Staff, but we do not know that when he was but we do know that when he was there in the Vietnamese prison, he cooperated with the communist news services in giving interviews there, nothing flattering to the United States. Usury, these are people that were interviewed. Information shows that he made over 32 tapes of propaganda for the Vietnamese government. Certainly, you do what you need to do to stay alive. Nobody would fault anybody for that. but there comes a point in time when enough is enough. Representative Dorm, this is Bob Dorham. They made those transcriptions, and in the transcriptions, I heard a POW who heard them coming into his cell and said, "Oh my God, is that Admiral McCain's son? Is that the Admiral's son? Is that Johnny telling us that our principal targets are schools, orphanages, hospitals, temples, churches?" That was Jane Fonda's line. Where are those transcriptions? Believe me, they are in the archives of the museum, the Braggant Military Phony Museum in Hanoi. McCain could not have wanted those to turn up. He knows that, I know that, and a few other people know that. And that's why he went against Bob Dole's legislation. Dumas. And he didn't want nobody looking into his background in that camp. What went on in that camp? That stuff is still classified, so nobody can see it. And he just had it classified forever, so nobody ever look at it. Lucier. That he was given special treatment and was put in a room with two other defectors who were later given special treatment. Although I will say to his credit, he refused to be repatriated as a result. Representative Dorham. This sounds so good at first. McCain was offered the chance to come home. They called him the Prince, and he could have, but nobody ever takes that one step beyond that. If Admiral John McCain Jr., if his son, a lieutenant senior grade, had accepted this princely status and come home in 1967 while the others would sit there for 5 years, what would the Navy have done with the son of an admiral who opted to get special treatment and come home? No Navy career, no House seat, no Senate seat. He would have been the end of his career. And they were offering him this chance to go home in one of three groups that came home in 68. Santoli. They were all collaborators. Representative Dorham. And McCain called them this, except for Bill Cagle, the slipperies, the slimies, and the sleazies. I once forgot of those names. I want one of those names, and he refreshed my memory. The slipperies, the slimies, and the sleazies. So that meant that he would have become a slimy, a sleazy, and a slippery, ruining his career, and the admiral's son goes home. What I'm saying is, yes, he chose to stay, but he had an alternative. If he ever wanted to have a life, and what would have done to his father? Douglas. And his activities were sufficiently consistent and widespread in opposing efforts to learn the truth that he has written up in a number of articles as a Manchurian Candidate in this issue. More on this issue. Representative Dorham. In Hanoi, he saw McCain turn red in the face. He even upset the term Rumpelstiltskin, jumping up and down in place in a rage. If you release any of these records that you have here in Hanoi on me or the other POWs, you will never get a diplomatic recognition. Usually, McCain may have been an expert at being a prisoner of war, but he was by no means an expert on the POW issue. And this was by John Labuto, McCain's character in Disaster Waiting. For a while, Ted was the senior ranking officer in a senior SRO. Now he's talking about Ted Guy. I believe the plantation, a POW camp on the outskirts of Hanoi, in which John McCain was being held. The senior ranking officer kept the chain of military order among the POWs. They took orders from him and kept discipline that way. The message many of the former POWs were delivering to the relatives of the thousands of men who did not come home in Operation Homecoming: forget it. We are the only living men. Give it up and move on with your lives. Of course, that was easy for them to say they had come home. The U.S. government never officially briefed returning POWs about the conspicuous bad violations of the Paris Peace Accords by both Hanoi and Washington, D.C. Washington refused to pay the $4.25 billion President Nixon secretly promised in a February 1st, 1973 letter to Premier Van Dong, and he kept hidden from Congress for 3 years. Hanoi failed to release the other group of 600 U.S. POWs they were holding as an insurance policy against these funds. If the truth had been told to our returning heroes, they would probably have led the charge for the return of their comrades, but they were not told. Instead, they were sent out to America's heartland as the war heroes we so desperately needed, McCain and Ted Guy included. Except that Ted Guy was intellectually honest enough to read all the new revelations that had begun surfacing in the 1980s. By 1991, he had seen enough. I was lied to, he told me. I am now certain we knowingly left men behind in captivity. Ted also got a fellow POW, Terry, and I'm not even going to try it on that one, to join our little group. It went around D.C. trying to get the U.S. government to reverse policy and negotiate for the living men still being held in Vietnam and Laos. Then McCain entered the picture. As the Senate committee heated up and more new information was surfaced, showing that indeed we did leave men behind, held against their will in Vietnam and Laos, McCain began a long and vicious campaign to discredit and shoot down any information or anyone advocating that the truth about our POWs be made public. Thus emerged for many to see the meaning and ugly side of John McCain. Ted Guy, his old senior ranking officer and friend and admirer, soon changed his mind about McCain. A series of odd phone calls to Ted in Missouri from McCain made him question the truthfulness and sanity of McCain. John would call me one day and said something, and then he'd call me a few days later, and I'd ask him about what he said on the first call, and John would be completely deny he ever said it. So Ted Guy began recording all these phone calls from McCain. I don't trust him anymore, said Colonel Guy. I think he's a total liar. From these tape calls, Ted soon discovered a frequent pattern. McCain often denied things he just said only a few days earlier. How to explain this? A liar or a total nut, or both? This is an article by Ted Sampley, who's passed away out of Kinston. We used to call him the Kinston Crazy. That's a story into itself. But borrowing from the title of a popular movie of some years ago, many activists who felt the fangs of this pit bull called himself the Manchurian Candidate. He didn't call himself that, they called him Manchurian Candidate. Is that a fair accusation to level at Senator McCain, the war hero and the former POW? In the movie Manchurian Candidate, actor Lawrence Harvey portrayed the character of a former POW and war hero of the Korean War, whose brainwashing by his communist captors resulted in his enemies being able to manipulate his actions, to trigger him to do their bidding, and all they had to do was have a phony play solitaire, him play solitaire with the Queen of Diamonds being the trigger that made him their body and soul. There is none with McCain. He was simply declared his own personal war on POW MIA activists, and one asked why. This is from Ted Sampley. The communists definitely had a sophisticated system of turning U.S. prisoners of war in Korea, and ironically, the movie, The Manchurian Candidate, fiction that it may be, was not a misrepresentation of the creative experiments and attempts by the communists to turn American prisoners of war into agents. According to some, the FBI has had a program to monitor activities of returned prisoners of war from Indochina. That FBI investigation is based on historical knowledge, which concluded that some American POWs had been turned into agents of the communists. Turning a prisoner of war is not necessarily the prisoner being convinced or re-educated by his captors to change his beliefs or politics. The process can involve the use of a variety of means, both subtle and brutal, elaborately contrived to manipulate an otherwise patriotic U.S. prison's situation or environment to a point where he is convinced that he must cooperate with his captors in order to remain alive. One method which has been used successfully by the KGB for their clandestine purposes was the use of threats of exposing embarrassing behavior, particularly in illicit sexual behavior. Why, Senator McCain, is there such a rush by you and others to do business with the same regime which you yourself once called degenerate, and whose leaders' hands are dripping with the blood of captives, helpless Americans, your fellow POWs? Have the Vietnamese flipped you on the Queen of Diamonds? The Mccain Story is a curious one. Records of McCain's period as a POW were classified upon his return from North Vietnam. His commanding officer while a POW was Colonel Ted Guy, who submitted a series of charges to military prosecutings, citing McCain for, among other things, treason. 33 of POWs court-martialed with McCain by far accused of the most serious crimes. It was also McCain, son of an admiral, who was also the son of an admiral who had to be protected. McCain was awarded a full pardon for his crimes by President Richard Nixon. Thus, the worst traitor in American history became the war hero to a generation. Not every POW activist despised John McCain. Among those, there were a graduation discussed. We're running out of time, but I want to get this a little bit before we get started. Many actors didn't like the way McCain behaved since he was freed. They detested his support for the normalization of relations with Vietnam, his lack of respect for them and their captives. He has unfairly attacked those who he says prey on the family numbers by selling them false hopes. But a few have let their ire take them even farther. A handful of POW MIA's actors are critical of John McCain's behavior during the war. And I'm going to just stop right there. And I've kind of given you all 3 points of the sides of the story of John McCain. I'll let you make your own conclusion. If you would like to send me an email, Dixon, D-I-X-O-N, Bill, 80 at Yahoo, and tell me what you think. I'd greatly appreciate it. But I've given you all the points of John McCain. Was he a Manchurian candidate? Was he a true war hero? It's hard for us who have not been POWs to sit back and go, well, he did this, he did that, because we hadn't been there. So the next Lessons of Vietnam show will be 12th of August, and we will be looking at Hanoi Jane, the good, bad, and the myths. And there's a lot of bad. August is National Purple Heart Month. We thank all those who received the Purple Heart for your thank you for your sacrifice. August 1st, the monthly POW-MI ceremony will be held downtown in Raleigh at the Capitol grounds at 12 o'clock. If you're coming, we'd love to see you. Wear your mask and keep your social distance, and hope to see you there. Again, thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something out of the show. If you dispute anything that I've read today or any of the shows, let me know so we can get it straightened out, because I want to make sure we get the truth. Thank y'all, and have a good evening.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.